we developed a really intentional focus, a little more than that, that it really truly is the best idea any of us can think of or come up with or steal or borrow from someone else that's going to rein in the bureaucracy, boost our economy, and it really does. You talk to any employer, David, what are they looking for? What are the key things they're looking for is regulatory certainty. An investor wants to know that if they put forward tremendous capital to build a new factory or buy a new piece of equipment, they need to know they're going to be allowed to use it. That some new regulation's going to come along and not make their piece of equipment unlawful or make their factory and the very product they create illegal. They need regulatory certainty. The REINS Act creates those checks and balances, creates that transparency, brings back accountability to the process so investors know they can invest in America. This is a critical component of what President Trump's trying to do to kind of kindle a manufacturing renaissance in our country, to bring back great paying jobs and make our country more robust and less reliant on other nations.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. We all remember Schoolhouse Rock showing us how a bill becomes a law. What it didn't show, though, was what happened next. Once a law is passed, whether at the federal or state level, agencies step in and start writing rules and regulations. And those can end up costing Americans time, money, or both. At the federal level, back in 2023, only 68 laws were passed, but there were over 3,000 rules written in that same timeframe. A solution to this issue is the REINS Act, short for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. It's a way to give legislatures more control over the rules and regulations agencies put in place. While it hasn't made it through at the federal level yet, several states have already passed their own versions, and some passed it in their most recent legislative sessions. Today, we're taking a closer look at which states have adopted REINS and what that means for the people who live there. I want to welcome my friend and colleague to the podcast, Eric Bott, who is a regional vice president for Americans for Prosperity. Eric, welcome.
Glad to be here, my friend. Good to see you, David.
Very happy, man. I'm very happy to have you here. I know this is an issue very close to your heart, and you've been leading the way at AFP for, kind of trying to guide this through different states and get kind of a critical mass where there's a real movement towards regulatory reform. And I really applaud a lot of the work that we're doing here. So I'm excited to talk about it. So first, can you explain how REINS works? Like, how does it allow the legislature to weigh in on rules and regulations?
Well, it's inherently simple. It just says that any newly proposed regulation that's going to have an undue cost impact on the federal government or in the states, so that state's economy stops dead in its tracks, and it has to go to the full legislature or Congress at the federal level for approval before it can proceed. And why this is so simple yet effective is that it flips the script. Right now, all the onus is on a state lawmaker or on a member of Congress to catch bad rules and use whatever tools are at their disposal to try to slow them down or improve them. This flips that on its head. It puts all the onus on the bureaucrat to come make their case and prove that this regulation is absolutely necessary. And we found it to be an incredibly effective tool in a handful of states that have so far passed it.
Don't some state agencies already get input from people and lawmakers before putting a new rule or regulation out?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no limit to the amount of transparency that we want to bring to the rulemaking process, or how many touch points we hope regulators can have with the regulated community, hopefully to improve regulations. But at the end of the day, what we really want to do is restore the separation of powers. We want to strengthen economies, and we really want to protect future generations from unforeseeable threats to our liberty or to our economies. And the REINS Act does all those three things. So putting the onus on the bureaucracy, they've got to come make their case to the people and say, this is why we need to do this regulation that's going to have a large cost impact on the people, that's going to hurt businesses or somehow impact our liberties in a major way. And by doing that, we are restoring that separation of powers that our founders intended. They never wanted to have unelected bureaucrats deciding how we live our lives. That was supposed to be the job of Congress, people we elect and that we can hold accountable. Look, David, if you look at just last year, the Biden administration, over 100,000 pages of federal regulations were promulgated. 100,000 pages. And the total cost impact on the American people is upwards of $1.5 trillion just on the regulations advanced last year. The total of all time is somewhere around $4 trillion. Just like we would see the impact of taxes, we feel the same way from regulations. We just don't, it's just not as clear to us, but it's impacting our businesses, impacting our neighbors and our families in very dramatic ways. And again, all of this is being done in the dark by unelected, nameless, faceless bureaucrats. The REINS Act pulls that out into the open and in an incredibly powerful way, because again, nothing happens unless it gets a full affirmative vote by either a state legislature in the case of a state REINS Act, or by Congress in the case of a federal regulation.
Yeah, we've done a number of episodes talking to individuals who have been impacted by rules in federal agencies chiefly, and the power that these agencies wield in their rulemaking and regulatory process is really phenomenal and disturbing, quite honestly. And it's also, we've also talked to like attorneys and legislators who are really trying to fight back against that. And I think though, like something like the REINS Act, it brings a systemic approach to try to solve for at least some of that. I think of it as right-sizing government, getting back to its constitutional basis, and how we think that the checks and balances and separations of powers should work. So I'm pretty excited about the work that you're doing here. So now you're in Wisconsin.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I am. Yeah.
And I know a former born and raised in Illinois. The listeners of the show know I reside in People's Republic of Illinois, but and Wisconsin's done some pretty remarkable things over the last 15 years. And I know you've been part of it and had an upfront seat to it. And a lot of it happened under Governor Scott Walker's tenure there. What in this regard, what did Governor Walker do and how has it affected the state of Wisconsin?
Oh, sure. Happy to talk about that. Let me back up and set the stage here before Governor Walker took office. During the 2000s, Wisconsin had a Democrat governor for most of the time. His name was Jim Doyle. And the bureaucrats in his administration used to kind of joke on the side that their goal was to make Wisconsin the, quote, California of the Midwest. And what they meant by that was that, if the federal government passed any regulation, they were going to one-up them or 10-up them, just like California is known to do. And so what we saw over the course of most of that decade were incredibly costly, heavy-handed regulations coming down from that administration that were having a huge negative impact on our economy and jobs. There was, give you a couple examples. We had a situation with an environmental water issue with mercury deposition. It's a terrible thing. It's a real environmental problem. None of us want to have mercury in our waterways because it can get into the fish. I like to catch and eat fish. I don't want mercury in. The thing is, in Wisconsin, we had done so much work to clean up our factories and our power plants in the 1980s and 90s that most of the pollution was not coming from our state. In fact, it wasn't even coming from our country anymore. It was coming from China. And yet our state regulators saw fit to craft a very complicated mercury regulation that had huge negative effects on the cost of energy in the state. We're talking upwards of $1 billion in cost impacts, as well as on one of our biggest employing industries, the paper industry. And so hundreds of people lost good paying jobs. Everyone saw their electricity bills go up dramatically, and there's no measurable environmental benefit for the cost. It didn't make sense. Another rule came along on the water side of things, again, dealing with phosphorus. Nutrient management is a critical environmental issue. It's a very real problem. We want to have clean waterways. If you have too much phosphorus or nitrogen in your waterways, you get algae blooms. Bad for the fish. It's bad for aquatic health. But again, this rule wasn't targeting the sources of the pollution, which tended to be either the natural environment or agriculture. It was targeting point sources, big factories, cheese makers, paper mills, again, food processors. They weren't really the sources of the pollution. So again, we're going to have a situation where there's negligible environmental benefit, but the cost was astronomical. In this case, the cost was upward of $7 billion. Now imagine if a legislature or a governor said, David, we want to raise your taxes $7 billion. And if I want to tax cheese makers in Wisconsin billions of dollars, and a lot of them are going to go out of business. I mean, people would be taking pitchforks and torches to the Capitol, and rightly so. But when these things happen through the regulatory environment, they're so opaque, people are unaware of them until it actually hits their pocketbook or a local business goes out of business. And that was the case in Wisconsin during Jim Doyle's tenure. And so our economy was tanking. I mean, you're not going to like this as an Illinois guy, but I mean, we would talk about how we were the next Illinois. Like we were on that trajectory to have a bankrupt pension system, constant tax increases, all our transit and roads falling apart, you name it, or we could have gone another direction. Right. And that is when Governor Walker got elected and we took a strong turn, first with massive pension reforms and fiscal reforms, massive tax cuts, huge labor reforms, you name it. And then then we addressed the regulatory side of the equation. And so for a number of years, having worked in state policy and politics during the 2000s and fought and defeated some of those very costly, ridiculous regulations that were putting, cheesemakers out of work in our state. Winning
How
some,
can you put
losing some.
cheesemakers out of work in Wisconsin? That's like sacrilege.
It is so wrong. I mean, what are they going to go after next? Beer, right? We don't want that. And again, it's not, we always want to talk about trade-offs, but when there's no measurable environmental benefit or it's very negligible and the costs are astronomical, we shouldn't be doing it. It doesn't make any sense. And if these sorts of terrible ideas came before the people and their representatives in the legislature, no one would vote for it. Even progressive Democrats wouldn't vote for it because they know they would be held accountable for these terrible ideas. Hence the idea of the REINS Act. Had a REINS Act been in place in Wisconsin in the 2000s, none of those terrible regulations would have gone through, or if they had, they would have been improved dramatically at a much lower cost and a much greater environmental benefit. And so it became an issue I was very curious about. I first learned about the REINS Act in 2013. A mentor of mine turned me on to, and I read about the federal idea. And I'll tell you that the genesis of that story is neat too. I think part of the reason the REINS Act is so effective is it didn't come from a think tank or a lawyer or a lobbyist or government. It just came from an American. There's a guy named Lloyd Rogers. He was grew up in an orphanage in Kentucky. He's a Korean War vet. Later in life, became very involved in local government in his community. And this is some time ago, almost 2 decades ago, another federal water regulation, there's a theme here, they're very costly, came along, and it was going to double property taxes in this community for that community to comply with the new regulation. And so he called his congressman, who was a guy named Jeff Smith at the time, and said, what, did you vote for this? Like, how did this terrible regulation come into play that's going to double our property taxes? And Congressman Smith said, actually, no, we never vote on environmental regulations, even things this consequential. And, this is from that conversation that a dialogue began that eventually led to this guy, Mr. Rogers, coming up with the concept of, well, maybe this is America. Maybe elected representatives should vote on really big laws. I think we all think that's how it works.
Imagine that.
That is not how it works. Congress votes on almost nothing, and increasingly state legislatures are voting on less and less things of consequence as compared to what the bureaucracy is up to. And so this is where that idea that REINS Act starts coming up first at the federal level and then at the states. And so I was involved in crafting the Wisconsin State REINS Act, which along with Florida were the first two. And Governor Scott Walker was kind enough to me to sign into law on my birthday in 2017 as sort of like a birthday present because I had spent a long time working on it. And now fast forward to today, I've been put in a position through Americans for Prosperity and the work I get to do with you to help, help advance this at the federal level. And we could talk about kind of where that's at in the system right now because it's an exciting time for the REINS Act, but also across the states. And we're driving a massive strategy that's accomplishing big results. We can jump into that too.
Yeah. So I think one of the strategic things that we believe at Americans for Prosperity is that, if something's not ripe at the federal level, maybe that a lot of times what we want to do is pass it and see it enacted at the state level so that there's kind of a clamoring for that kind of reform eventually at the federal level. So you've been working with a lot of our state teams to pass the REINS Act or at least have positive movement in a lot of states around the country. Can you kind of tell that story a little?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. About a year ago, we developed a really intentional focus, a little more than that now, that it really truly is the best idea any of us can think of or come up with or steal or borrow from someone else that's going to rein in the bureaucracy, boost our economy, and it really does. You talk to any employer, David, what are they looking for? One of the key things they're looking for is regulatory certainty. An investor wants to know that if they put forward tremendous capital to build a new factory or buy a new piece of equipment, they need to know they're going to be allowed to use it. That some new regulation is going to come along and not make their piece of equipment unlawful or make their factory and the very product they create illegal. They need regulatory certainty. The REINS Act creates those checks and balances, creates that transparency, brings back accountability to the process so investors know they can invest in America. This is a critical component of what President Trump's trying to do to kind of kindle a manufacturing renaissance in our country, to bring back great paying jobs and make our country more robust and less reliant on other nations. We have to get the regulatory piece right if that's going to work. And the REINS Act is a great component of that. Go to the state level. Once we launched that push, we saw a really good response from lawmakers all over the country. It started in Kansas, where we saw the bill enacted over the misguided veto of their Democrat governor last year, and it's continued now this year, where our teams have worked to pass state REINS Acts now in Oklahoma, Utah, Wyoming, and Kentucky. And I think we'll likely see REINS Acts enacted in Ohio, Louisiana, and North Carolina before the end of the year. And I've got a whole lot more planned for 2026. But
so those are some big states too. I mean, these aren't all just little ones.
It's great. And I mean, other states, there's more than just the REINS Act. We talk about that. It's part of kind of fixing how the Administrative Procedure Acts of states, or how regulations are made, right? If you get how regulators work correct, you don't have to play whack-a-mole with bad ideas all the time. You can fix it all at once. And there are great things happening all over. Both Montana and Texas, for instance, kind of passed foundational reforms that set the stage for a future REINS Act. So there's been wonderful momentum, great responses from state lawmakers all over the country since we brought this idea forward in a big way. And I should add, again, part of why I'm so excited about this, it's not just theoretical. So I talked about what inspired me to push for the REINS Act in Wisconsin, these horribly costly regulations that didn't have a corresponding benefit. What have we seen on the back end? So it's been enacted since 2017 in Wisconsin. It's working. We have not seen a single regulation with a high cost impact promulgated in the state since. 5 times Governor Evers, our current very progressive governor, has made attempts at some level or another, all very similar to the stories I share. Big, costly regulations that don't have a real public benefit to speak of. It's just, politicians going after the political rivals, some industry they don't like, trying to score points with their allies, whatever it might be, but the wrong motivations, the wrong reasons. And each time someone would come up with the basic economics, the expected costs, the bureaucrats would drop it. They didn't want to put time, effort, treasure into writing a regulation that they know would never pass a legislature. And so this isn't a concept that's theoretical at this point. We've seen it both in Florida and Wisconsin work marvelously. The regulatory burden in Wisconsin has been flat, despite close to 6 years of a very radical progressive administration. And in Florida, actually, the administrative burden has declined pretty dramatically since the enactment of the REINS Act. And I'll tell you, in Florida, it's going to get even better. One of the exciting reforms that their legislature advanced this year that our team worked on is to increase the frequency of reviewing existing regulations and to sort of retroactively apply the REINS Act. So if there were already regulations that were on the books before the REINS Act was enacted in that state, they're going to come back up for review. And now the bureaucracy is going to have to make a justification if they're having a really negative impact on that state's economy. So that's kind of a first of its kind in the nation. And I'm excited to see how that bears fruit over, the next decade.
I think, we're all really excited about the progress that's being made at the state level. What have been some of the challenges that our teams have faced at the state level?
I'll tell you, the single biggest challenge is governors who feel attacked by the concept, right? If we're effectively asking the politicians to do something they don't want to do. We're asking them to give up power. We're asking executives to return power that's truly legislative power that was improperly delegated by legislatures. We're asking them to return it back to the legislature, right? Lawmaking in our state constitutions, under federal constitution, is a responsibility of Congress and the legislatures. But they've delegated most of the responsibilities over to the executive branches at the state and federal level. And that's wrong. And we want to correct that. But that's a hard ask to make. And so a lot of governors, both Democrat and Republican, feel like the concept is somewhat insulting to them. And it's not. I look at some of these states where we've been working on this, a state like Utah where we enacted it, a state like Wyoming. This bill is not a criticism of any current administration. In those cases, we think they're doing a great job. The point is to keep it that way. And I can turn to COVID as the justification for that. So a lot of the power of the REINS Act is not about what's going to happen today or in 5 years. It's about what will happen to our grandchildren in 20 or 30 years from the next completely unforeseeable thing Like none of us 10 years ago imagined that there would be some novel virus coming out of China. And the result would be that just about every governor in this country, Democrat and Republican alike, would lock down our states, ban funerals, ban church, close beaches, ban fishing, right? All these things that we now know to be truly ludicrous, that had no measurable positive benefit on slowing the spread of the illness or increasing public health, yet everyone did them. And a lot of states continue to do them even after they knew better. The REINS Act is the solution to all that. If a state enacts a REINS Act, it is a check on a future governor a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades from now, the next time something tragic like that happens, where they'll be able to act and issue emergency orders and take the protective actions that they need to take for whatever the situation is. But at the end of that, it has to come back to the legislature and the people get a say. There's going to be transparency and there are going to be checks and balances. And hopefully we won't see the types of abuses that unfortunately we saw in many states a handful of years ago. That's what the REINS Act's really about. It's not about any particular governor today. It's about what we face that we can't even foresee way into the future. And in that regard, I think it's truly a legacy opportunity for governors. I mean, one thing, it's an opportunity to show humility in politics, which is rare and hard to do. And I think really shows that you're a stand-up person, a principled person. You know, it gives every governor pushing this has that opportunity, which is terrific. But two, what else can you come up with to protect your grandchildren that's better than this? Like, this is the best idea a lot of really smart people in Washington and all over the country have to protect our grandkids. And so when I look at like deep red states, like the Dakotas, for instance, this is about the best thing you could do probably in your next legislative session. You have, South Dakota has the lowest regulatory burden in America, and it is a booming economy. And the two things along with their tax climate are the big reasons for it. Let's keep it that way. The REINS Act is going to do more than just about anything else we can come up with to help keep things that way. And so I'm encouraged a lot more states are starting to look at it that way. We saw, Governor Stitt in Oklahoma recently just wrapped his arms around the REINS Act and gave it a big old hug and signed it. And I was thrilled to see that. Governor Landry in Louisiana has been incredibly supportive as their legislature works this through the process right now. And so increasingly we're seeing, Republican governors get on board, just like Scott Walker did way back in, 2016, 2017.
I think one of the things that's so exciting is that we're really just asking that our leaders, our legislative leaders, whether it be federal or state, be empowered to do their jobs or actually step up and do their jobs and be our voice, and be a check on, power that's kind of gotten out of control.
Yeah. Well, I say that's the second hard part is you're asking legislators to be accountable. And a lot of politicians don't want to do that either. So thankfully, many do. And in a lot of these states, they're kind of screaming for, no, we want to do our jobs, which is terrific. But I'll tell you, one of the barriers we do run into is you'll have state lawmakers who fear that a REINS Act will bog them down. Oh my gosh, there's so many regulations and how are we going to deal with all these things? Again, I'll turn to the experience of Wisconsin. No regulations have actually gone to the legislature yet for a REINS Act triggered approval yet because the bureaucracy just gives up. They don't, they know better. They don't, they're incentivized just like anyone else. They don't want to put in time and effort into a proposal that they know will never pass muster in the legislature. And so you end up not triggering it. And I think the end result is you end up having the bureaucracy go and work more closely with the regulated community and come up with less costly ways to do their job, right? I think we end up with less regulation and we end up with better regulation as a result.
That's great. Well, hey, as we're gonna run out of time here soon, but I wanted to hear about what's the outlook on the federal level.
Yeah, it's all about the bird rule. So here's the good news. Way back in February, when what has now become the big beautiful bill started moving in the House with the first steps, the House leadership put the REINS Act into their resolution. And President Trump came out and endorsed it as truly an American first policy with everything else in the package. And I think that was a critical first step. Again, I've mentioned with governors, humility can be a factor. Here we have our president, President Trump, saying, I support this. I'm willing to give this power back and this responsibility back to Congress, which I think is wonderful. They've gone through now a number of additional steps, with the most recent being the House passing their first kick at the big beautiful bill, and the REINS Act is included. A lot of kudos go to Kat Kamik, a congresswoman from Florida who's been the champion in the House this time around, pushing that and really keeping it in there. And I think it serves a lot of tactical value to leadership in both the House and Senate and to President Trump, because it's a concept wildly supported by the majority of the real conservatives, the Freedom Caucus types in Congress, because they know that this has the huge value to reduce burdens on the American people and businesses, and to really be a huge boost for our economy. I mean, pass this thing, you're going to see investment in America take off like crazy. So we got it through the House. It's in a great spot. Now it's in the Senate. That's where the Byrd Rule comes into play. And I'm not an expert on the Byrd Rule, but to simply explain what it is. Congress gets one cake at reconciliation, which is an opportunity to pass a big package with just 51 votes. Otherwise, they've got to get past the filibuster, which takes a 60-vote majority. I don't think, looking at this Congress and the level of polarization in America, you're going to get 60 votes on anything. So you got to get it done in reconciliation. But there are certain rules in place as to what can go in a reconciliation bill and what cannot. That's called the Byrd Rule. That's why I don't know when this will air, but this week, as we're sitting here, I think we're going to hear a name in the news a lot. And that's the parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough. She's arguably maybe the most powerful person in American politics this week, as she begins to look at not just the REINS Act, but all sorts of things that are currently in the big beautiful bill that may be questionable for reconciliation under the Senate rules. So we're hopeful. I know there were many brilliant people in the Senate and in the House that worked very hard this time around to craft the REINS Act in a very unique way, so that they believe it will survive this challenge, this rule, and stay in the ultimate package. But we'll see. And I think we'll know relatively soon here, early in June, as to whether or not it makes muster. And if it stays in, I mean, I feel pretty good about it. Senator Mike Lee from Utah has been kind of the champion this go round, really pushing it. And he's done a wonderful job articulating why it's so important to America. And I'm sure would do his utmost to champion it through the rest of the process if indeed it survives this reconciliation challenge.
Well, that's great. That's a little further along than I realized. So I'm excited about it. We'll see what happens. The federal level is such a balancing act. But in the meantime, you and our other state leaders are going to keep pushing this through various states across the country so people get a say in the regulations and the costs that are levied on them. I think that's fabulous.
It's a beautiful moment for Administrative Procedure Act wonks, I guess I would say. There really is a bit full. I think it's maybe a little bit of a response to the overbearingness of government during COVID, and probably inspired a little bit by the efforts of DOJ and sort of President Trump's campaign to rein in the excesses of government. But all of it has come together to really inspire people in the states. And I mentioned a handful of states where we passed it, a few more where it's up yet this session. But there were bills introduced in more than 20 states this session on reins.
Wow,
like
great.
And so the momentum's real, and it's hot. And I love seeing these policies that maybe they're not the most interesting to most people, but they are the most impactful. And they're going to have a huge benefit for the states that enact them. So it's a good time to work in public policy.
Well, to all of our benefit, regulatory reform nerds are on the march across America. So I'm super excited for it's going to pay dividends for Americans and taxpayers. Well, Eric, I appreciate you joining us. I mean, it's so great to see that states have taken this issue on and making sure that rules and regulations aren't going to really have a costly impact on people living in that state and hopefully nationally. So thanks so much for all your hard work.
I'm glad for the opportunity, David. Good talking with you.
Yeah. Well, folks, if you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.